It was extraordinary, wasn't it, Pauline, to see that Jacinda Nampijinpa-Price wouldn't even express support for her leader today. Doesn't that inflame the situation further?
Well, Chris, I'll put it this way. What support has she got from the leader? Without really looking at history, and history is repeating itself here, which a lot of people don't realise and understand. In 1997, Barry Jones, then the president of the Labor Party and also who was a former minister under the Labor Party, at the Population Forum said, we purely brought people in from Greece and China purely for the vote. He admitted that. Labor, prior to the 1996 election, which Howard won, they had a big immigration issue because they were bringing a lot of people from other countries. And the public were actually angry about it, and 70% of Australians didn't want the mass immigration they were having then. Only 3% wanted it. So in a lot of ways, history is repeating itself because they have, and remember, prior to the last election, they processed 700,000 people to get their citizenship just prior to the election. Now, I'm not targeting Indians. I've had Indians stand as candidates of One Nation. They are hard workers, they're business people, and I respect that. But it is true in what she says. Labor have done this for decades to target certain populations, to bring them into the country, and of course they're grateful for the opportunity to come to Australia. So whereas their allegiance to them is to the political party that's given the opportunity to come to Australia. Let's have the debate.
Before we continue, do us a little favor by subscribing to the channel because over 98% of you watching haven't subscribed. It costs you nothing, not even a penny, to join this channel. Have you subscribed? Thanks so much.
Don't shut her down. This is what happened to me.
Well, I don't think anyone's trying to shut her down. I mean, I agree with you. I think, A, the immigration levels are too high now, and that's what Jacinda Nampijinpa-Price was saying.
Right.
Secondly, I think you find a lot of evidence and data over the years to show that all immigrants, when they come to the country, tend to be Labor voters initially. As they get settled and do better, their voting allegiance spreads more broadly. But Labor gets a boost out of higher rates of immigration. I think that's a political reality. But the question here, and this is the problem, I don't know why the senator doesn't just deal with this and move on. She singled out the Indian community and the higher levels of Indian immigration as being brought in because they're going to vote Labor. Now, I just don't think there's any evidence for that. And I think it's demeaning to the Indian community because most people know, and I've heard it from all sorts of sources, that of course, and I've seen it with my own eyes, Indians are a great cohort of migrants, that they're really well integrated migrants who are doing great things in this country, and they don't want to be slighted either accidentally or deliberately by politicians. So shouldn't Jacinda Nampijinpa-Price clear that up?
I totally agree with you, Chris. And yes, it is, because these people have come here for a new life and are integrating, working extremely hard, as I said. But let's move on from there and let's debate about the fact is what's Labor's plans? Are they doing the mass migration purely for the vote? And I have no doubt the Libs have done the same. They've targeted who they wanted to bring in the country. It was evident under the Morrison government, and I know that for a fact. So, both of them are responsible for it, but it comes down to the big argument. Mass migration, the public have had enough of it, and they're sick and tired of the Labor Party bringing them in purely for the vote, plus also they're bringing in purely to bring down, the gross domestic product and for productivity, and that's not the way to run the country.
I think Dick Smith made a really good point on this program this week where he said that each party should have a population plan. They should go to the election with a policy that delivers a population plan for what they think this country will have as a population in 10, 15, 50 years' time. Do you think that that's something we should get from the parties before the next election?
Of course we should. Chris, I put a private member's bill on the floor of Parliament to have a plebiscite for the people of Australia to vote on about a population plan. They're not interested. They voted it down. I think my figures that I've been contemplating is about 35 million by the year 2040. We need to level it out. Our immigration plan is about 130,000 a year. You've got about that many that leave the country. Your deaths and your births are about the same. We need to level it out till we actually get the infrastructure and the services that we need to provide to the Australian people. We're too high at the moment. That's why the cost of living is going through the roof and people are actually struggling.
Thanks for joining us, Pauline. Appreciate it. Pauline Hanson there, forthright as ever.
A revealing media exchange has reignited debate over immigration, political loyalty, and population growth in Australia. As Pauline Hanson weighed in on controversy surrounding fellow Senator Jacinta Nampa and internal party tensions, the discussion quickly moved beyond personalities into a broader argument about whether Australia's major parties use immigration policy as a political strategy rather than a national planning tool. The immediate trigger was criticism directed at Price for remarks linking high immigration levels, particularly from India, to electoral advantage for the Labour Party. When asked whether Price's refusal to fully support her party leader worsened divisions, Hanson reframed the issue entirely. In her view, the real story was not internal party conflict, but a recurring historical pattern in Australian politics. Governments allegedly using immigration intake to shape voter demographics. Hanson argued that the controversy around Price echoed earlier backlash she herself faced decades ago when raising similar concerns. To support her argument, Hanson invoked statements attributed to former Labour figures from the 1990s, suggesting migrant intake had electoral implications. Her point was not simply historical recollection, but political framing. She suggested that debates over migration and voting patterns have long existed, but are often dismissed or silenced when raised by certain politicians. By presenting Price's experience as a repeat of her own, Hanson positioned both his voices challenging what she portrays as bipartisan political strategy. The interviewer partly agreed with one element of Hanson's claim that immigrants often initially support Labour before diversifying politically over time. But he challenged the core accusation that specific communities, especially Indian migrants, were deliberately brought in to secure votes. He argued there was little evidence for that assertion and warned that such framing risked stereotyping highly successful and well-integrated migrant communities. This exchange highlighted a central tension in migration debates, distinguishing between discussion of policy effects and perceived targeting of ethnic groups. Hanson responded by attempting to separate respect for migrants from criticism of policy. She emphasized that Indian Australians are widely recognized as hardworking, entrepreneurial, and strongly integrated, and she insisted her concern was not with migrants themselves, but with political motives behind intake levels. Yet, she maintained that both major parties, Labour and Liberal, have historically adjusted immigration settings in ways that align with political interests. By expanding blame beyond Labour to include the former Morrison government, she reinforced her long-standing narrative that mainstream parties manipulate migration for advantage while avoiding honest debate. From Hanson's perspective, the central issue is scale. She argued that mass migration has exceeded Australia's capacity to absorb newcomers without straining infrastructure, housing, and public services. This framing shifts the debate from identity politics to economic pressure. Population growth, she suggested, is driving cost of living increases, housing shortages, and infrastructure deficits. Whether or not migration policy affects voting patterns, she argued its immediate effect on everyday Australians is rising living costs and overcrowded services. The interviewer introduced a policy-focused idea from businessman Dick Smith that political parties should present explicit long-term population plans before elections. This proposal moved the conversation toward governance rather than rhetoric. Hanson strongly endorsed the concept, noting she had previously proposed mechanisms for public input on population targets and immigration levels. According to her, such proposals were rejected by major parties unwilling to commit to transparent population strategies. Hanson outlined her own preferred framework, stabilizing Australia's population growth by limiting net migration until infrastructure and services catch up. She suggested a target population around 35 million by 2040 and annual immigration levels, roughly balancing departures. Her argument reflects a broader strand of Australian political thought that views migration not only through economic demand, but through capacity constraints, housing supply, transport systems, healthcare access, and urban congestion. This exchange reveals how immigration debates in Australia increasingly intersect with questions of national planning rather than purely cultural concerns. Hanson's rhetoric often blends both, warning about demographic change while emphasizing infrastructure strain, but the policy substance centers on growth management. Critics argue such narratives risk fueling suspicion toward migrants. Supporters argue they address legitimate planning failures ignored by major parties. The clash between these perspectives was visible throughout the interview. The controversy around price illustrates how sensitive the political terrain has become. Linking migration levels to voting behavior touches on identity, loyalty, and belonging, issues that quickly escalate beyond policy discussion. The interviewer's pushback reflected mainstream concern that implying ethnic communities vote as blocs undermines social cohesion. Hanson's defense reflected populist concern that raising structural questions about migration is unfairly stigmatized. Both positions highlight competing definitions of acceptable political debate in multicultural societies. Underlying the argument is a broader structural reality. Immigration policy does influence demographics, labor markets, and electoral geography over time, but proving intentional partisan manipulation is far more complex. Academic research generally shows migrant voting patterns diversify across generations and socioeconomic status. Political narratives, however, often simplify these dynamics into strategic motives or demographic fears. The exchange demonstrates how media debates can compress complex demographic processes into stark political claims. The discussion also touches on a strategic dilemma for major parties. High migration can support economic growth and workforce needs, particularly in aging societies. Yet, rapid population increases can exacerbate housing shortages and infrastructure lag if planning fails to keep pace. Governments therefore face pressure both to sustain migration and to restrain it, creating space for minor parties to argue that neither major party is willing to impose limits. Hanson's message draws strength from this perceived gap between economic policy and lived experience. Another dimension is electoral geography. Rapid population growth concentrates in major cities where housing affordability and congestion pressures are most visible. Political narratives linking migration to cost of living pressures resonate strongly in such contexts. Hanson's framing that migration levels drive housing and service strain connects demographic policy directly to household economics. Whether empirically accurate in each case, this linkage has become a powerful political narrative in Australia and other developed countries experiencing similar growth patterns. Ultimately, the exchange reflects a deeper contest over how migration should be discussed in democratic politics. One approach emphasizes inclusivity, integration success, and economic contribution of migrants. Another emphasizes scale, planning capacity, and perceived political incentives. Hanson's commentary represents the latter perspective, insisting debate about numbers and policy motives should not be dismissed as prejudice. Critics maintain that framing migration in electoral terms risks stigmatizing communities regardless of intent. As Australia approaches future elections, population growth and immigration levels are likely to remain central political themes. The call for explicit population planning raised in this exchange may gain traction as infrastructure, housing, and cost of living pressures persist. Whether framed as economic management, demographic strategy, or political controversy, migration policy continues to shape Australia's national debate. In the end, the conversation illustrates how immigration discussions rarely remain technical. They quickly expand into questions of political trust, national direction, and social cohesion. Hanson's intervention, whatever one's view of it, underscores that migration policy is not only about borders or visas. It is about how a country envisions its future size, capacity, and identity.